This is the only rifle you'll ever need when playing Warframe in 2025. And yes baby, I'm talking about the thing with the bling, the one and only Burston Prime Incarnon. Because if it doesn't have at least 3 words in the name, it ain't a good gun. In today's Warframe guide, I'm gonna tell you where to get the Burston, how it works, which Incarnon Evolutions you want to go for. I have 3 different builds, and I also want to share some of my favorite synergies with this weapon. As always, big shout out to all the generous channel members who help me keep the lights on. And now, let's jump right into it. First of all, where do you even get the Burston Prime Incarnon from? I'm so glad you asked, and I'm fully aware that you didn't ask because you probably already know it. But anyway, if you want to get the Burston Prime for yourself, that's actually pretty darn easy because there are a lot of void relics that contain the parts for it. And if I'm not mistaken, then the Burston Prime, together with some other OG weapons like the Bratton, is one of the very few Prime items in the game that never gets vaulted, meaning no matter when you see this video, you will always be able to farm it for yourself. And then, naturally, if you want to turn it into its Incarnon form, you need an Incarnon adapter, which you can either get from the weekly Deviri circuit, the Steel Path version of it, or if you just got that ka-ching going on, you can also just go to Cavallero on the Zeraman 10-0, smash some good old plat on the table, and get the Incarnon adapter plus all the resources you need for the evolution right away. But up next, let's talk about how the Burston Prime actually works. And don't worry, I'm gonna keep it short because I know the Burston Prime is not necessarily the most special weapon under the sun. First off, at base, like the name already suggests, the Burston Prime is a burst rifle firing 3-round bursts with a decent magazine size. In terms of stats, we have a relatively high base damage of 46, most of it being slash, so that's very good, especially given the fat 30% status chance, so you can get quite some bleeds out of this bad boy. However, the crit performance of 18% chance with 1.8 times multiplier is... so yeah, not necessarily a red number generator right there. Just one more interesting thing here, the Burston Prime has a special weapon augment mod, this one's called Gilded Truth, giving you 80% more fire rate, and while that's definitely pretty nice compared to other fire rate mods, the Burston doesn't really need fire rate in my opinion, especially not in the Incarnon form, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend this one. Let's now talk about the stuff that you're probably here for in the first place, that being the Incarnon mode. Just like with other Incarnon weapons, you charge the Incarnon meter under your crosshairs by hitting headshots or headshot kills. Once the meter is full, or also before that, if you're one of the people who likes driving around with a half-empty gas tank, you can press the alt-fire button to transform it into its Incarnon mode, which will drastically change the weapon. First of all, it will stop dealing physical damage and start inflicting only pure heat. However, there is a little bit of a problem, that being that the base damage goes down from 46 to only 13, which really isn't all that great on paper, but don't worry, we're gonna get to that in a second. The crit chance gets massively increased to 28%, crit multiplier also up to 3x, which is very nice, and the 30% status chance, we luckily keep that. However, the buffs in the Incarnon form are not only subject to the weapon's stats, but also it gains a little bit of an AoE mechanic, because with the Incarnon fire, whenever your bullet hits an enemy or a surface, you also deal a bit of AoE heat damage in a 2-meter radius. Not necessarily the biggest AoE, but we can still cook up something pretty nice with it that I'm gonna show later. Oh yeah, by the way, and the most important thing, almost forgot that, it becomes fully automatic with a very, very high fire rate in the Incarnon form, which is probably the one reason why most people prefer the Incarnon over the normal fire. And as always, like the video so your Burston Prime Incarnon will always show up as an option in the Deep Archimedia. If it was only that easy. I mean, cheers for your support. But Incarnon here, Incarnon there, let's talk about the Incarnon Evolutions next. The first evolution is pretty standard stuff, just unlocking the Incarnon form and that's it. So let's go over right to the second, which already becomes quite interesting. We have the choice of 2 base damage increases, both giving us plus 42, which is very welcome given the very low 13 in the Incarnon form. However, the special thing here is, the one gives us plus 5 base multi-shot on the final burst in the magazine. This is before modding, so with the right multi-shot mods, you can turn this into a crazy shotgun. however only on the final magazine burst, which means A, it's not available in the Incarnon mode, only with the normal fire, and then even with the normal fire, I think the only way where this would kinda sorta make sense is if you had a Riven or something that would reduce your magazine size by over 90%, ensuring you're always on the last burst, and then combine that with ammo efficiency, making your last burst like 5 bursts or something. But yeah, as you saw, there are quite some ifs in that sentence, so I just don't think this is all too good. What I would go for instead is this one right here, Fortress Salvo, 42 more damage, just like with the other one, but if your Warframe has more than 450 armor, you gain plus 2 meters of punch through, which I think is very great with a fast-firing weapon like the Burston. Evolution 3, and this one is a teensy tiny little bit boring because all of this also kinda sorta just applies to the normal fire. This one here giving you a base magazine capacity of plus 21, kinda decent, you don't have to reload all that often. This one giving you more reload speed if you empty the magazine entirely and don't reload earlier. Again, pretty darn nice for the normal fire, but the Incarnon can't use it. And this one is the only thing that can even be used in the Incarnon form, reducing your weapon recoil by 50%. Not really necessary because the recoil of this gun is essentially 0 right off the bat. So what you do here is really up to you, whether you want to have some more comfort in the normal fire to more conveniently amp up the Incarnon meter, or you go for the negative recoil so that you have at least something for the Incarnon mode. That's what I did, but you certainly don't have to. And then the final evolution, oh boy, this is where it gets really strong. The first one here is objectively the wrong choice because all it does is give you 20% more stacking damage whenever you hit a full burst, meaning it doesn't count for the Incarnon mode, but even if you want to use it as a normal burst fire mode, it's still pretty bad because what this thing here doesn't say is that it only stacks up to 5 times, so you can't get more than 100% base damage out of this, stacking additively with Serration, so it's just really not all that good of a buff. No, what we're going for is either this one right here, which is essentially Galvanized Aptitude, plus 40% direct damage per status type affecting the target. This can give you a whole lot of damage if you have some proper priming going on, definitely a viable choice. Or, my personal favorite, this one right here, increasing your base critical chance by 22%. Remember, just by using the Incarnon mode alone, we already increase our crit chance to 28%, meaning with the plus 22% here, we go up to a whopping 50% crit chance in the Incarnon mode. That is a whole bunch, my personal favorite here. Not saying you have to go for it, you could also go for this one, but I just like the big red numbers, and I know you do too. Just admit it, you can't fool me, we all love it. But now comes the moment that you have all been waiting for. Let's talk builds. In this video, I have 3 different builds prepared for you. One that focuses on dealing as much direct damage as possible. Another one that focuses more on the heat damage that the weapon has with the high status chance, going for heat DOT. And the third one is a very funny blast build, which is actually incredibly strong on this weapon, albeit only on a couple frames. Let's start out though with the direct damage build. This one right here should not surprise anyone. In the Arcane, we go for primary Deadhead, but you could also go for primary Merciless or anything else, mainly for all the damage that it provides. Multi-Shot comes from Galvanized Chamber, then we'll go for Prime Tread to give us even more punch through and increase the fire rate even further, Bane of Grenier as a faction damage mod, and then I go for High Voltage and Malignant Force as the elements, giving Corrosive. I went for this so that I can actually use the corrosion to strip away a bit of enemy armor, increasing our status chance with the 60/60s. If you wanted to focus purely on the most damage possible, you could also replace these two with their 90 counterparts, giving more damage for a trade-off in less status chance. Since this build here is headshot focused, I also went for a Galvanized Scope. However, if you prefer to not go for headshots, then you can replace this one right here with something like Galvanized Aptitude, maybe Serration for even more damage. The choice here is really yours. And then, of course, Crit with Critical Delay and Vital Sense for more crit chance and crit damage. However, if right out the gating the enemies like a train is not necessarily your type of playstyle and you wanna see the world burn, then this right here is gonna be the Heat DOT build. Since we're now not technically headshotting the enemies anymore, we go for primary Merciless for the base damage, plus Serration. I know double stacking the same stat is usually a bad thing, but since we already have heat damage on the weapon, we just have this slot here free. If you didn't want to go for Serration, just pick something else, of course. Point Strike and Vital Sense for the crit performance. If you wanted to, you could also replace Point Strike with Critical Delay. It depends on your personal preference whether the trade-off in fire rate is worth it to you. Then Thermite Rounds and Galvanized Aptitude for more status chance, and also, with Galvanized Aptitude, even more base damage. If you wanted to, however, you could replace Thermite Rounds because we have heat on the weapon in the first place, so we don't technically need it. You could also go for something like Hammer Shot, giving you more status chance and critical damage. However, no matter what you do, please do not go for Firestorm because the AoE of your little explosions is only 2 meters, so with plus 44%, that's really not going to do all too much. I don't think this would be a good pick here. And then finally, since it is, of course, damage over time, we have to go with a Bane mod and then Rifle Elementalist on top, making sure that we deal the most damage possible with those burns. And lastly, I have a build for you that I think is really fun. Unfortunately, only works on a couple Warframes out there, but if you have them, that blast damage will hit hard. Let's check it out. This right here is a blast build. The Arcane is primary Crux, giving us up to 300 whopping % more status chance, which is very OP for a blast build. The ammo efficiency unfortunately does not work in the Incarnon mode, so that's sort of a dump stat, but the status chance is really good. Because we don't have base damage from here, we naturally have to go for Serration and also a little bit of Galvanized Aptitude here for the base damage. Then of course, crit chance, crit damage. Also here, you could go for Critical Delay if you really wanted to, but I feel fire rate, especially on the blast build, is nice, so I just went for Point Strike. Multi-shot, and also here, since blast is a damage over time thing, Bane mod plus Elementalist are a must. In this last slot right here, I went for Rime Rounds, which nicely combines with the heat of the Incarnon Fire into Blast, so we only need one elemental mod to ensure the blast is gonna happen. However, I personally believe Rime Rounds is actually not the optimal choice here, because while it gives you even more status chance, we have so much status chance on this build, we don't really need the 60% from here. Instead, I would actually recommend going for Primed Cryo Rounds for 165% cold, much more damage, which is very good. Just happens to be that I need a couple more format to make this whole thing happen. You probably want to have Primed Cryo Rounds in here if you really want to min-max the living heck out of this. And by the way, for all the builds that I showed so far, which use Serration as a base damage mod, if you wanted to, you could subsume Sido9's invisibility skill on whichever frame you're wielding this weapon with, to then allow yourself to use Spectral Serration, which deals like twice the damage of normal Serration. So yeah, if your Burston Prime happens to be in the hands of an invisible frame, absolutely go for Spectral Serration. It's really that strong. But now, before we end the video for today, there is one last chapter that I have for you, and this would be some of my personal favorite synergies with the Burston Prime, Warframes in whose hands this thing really shines more than usual. First of all, and this is specifically true for the Blast build that I showed previously, you need a Warframe with a good grouping ability. Because the AoE on the Incarnon Fire is only 2 meters, if you go with someone like Korra, like Mag, like Nidus, anyone who can really blob enemies up, it is glorious because you hit so many of them at the same time, even though the AoE is that small. My personal favorite here would be Nidus because he not only very quickly groups enemies up in one blob and holds them together, which is very important, but he additionally has the ability to further buff up weapons. By the way, in case you want to see more on that synergy, I talked about this as well in my full Nidus guide. The next synergy that I really love, not just for the Burston Prime, but basically for any weapon in the game, would be an Invisible Harrow. Use Sido9's invisibility skill from the helmet, put it on your Harrow, and then not only will you be invisible to trigger Spectral Serration, giving you much more weapon damage, but you can also use Arcane Crepuscular on Harrow, which is very nice because, we all know Harrow, he is the king of red crits, and with all of this combined, you will have one of the filthiest weapons platforms in the entire game, perfect with one of the GOATs in the weapon roster, the Burston Prime Incarnon. If, however, more and more crit is not necessarily your cup of tea, you can always go for other weapon buffers like Saren or maybe also Oraxia, who give you ridiculously high elemental damage bonuses on every gun. My personal favorite here would still be Saren, also with the Side 09 Subzoom to be invisible and then get all the elemental buffs that she has. The damage numbers that you deal with this are just absolutely freaking insane. But which frames do you use with your Burston Prime? Let us know in the comments down below. And if you want to know all the secret reveals about Warframe's future, then don't miss this video right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Nostlinux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkanio2, Skylar Bowser, Mihawky, Phil the Meme, Sorkotes the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Trolloloxen, Helen Tages, Patrasader, Boomia1, Mr. Gamesplays, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other, hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.